Hello, hello. Welcome back to 10th grade history. Going to pick right back up where we left off. All right. If you remember, we were talking about the French Revolution. Lots of problems, lots of turmoil, lots of government after government after government. And we left off with quite the ironic thing. I remember we had the Committee of Public Safety. Remember who was in charge of the Committee of Public Safety? Yes, Maximilien Robespierre, very nice. And we talked about how that they had the phrase liberty, equality, fraternity, and I think that's it, right? Liberty, equality, fraternity, the big three. Let me see. Hold on. Yes, liberty, equality, and fraternity. And we talked about how that was kind of an ironic statement, right? Because it led to tens of thousands of Frenchmen being killed by the Committee of Public Safety for basically because they didn't agree with who they were or what they did. We talk about how they had that levée in masse or levée en masse, that everyone, it was one of the first times that everyone was called to join the war effort. We talk about a coalition, a temporary alliance of nations. And then we talk about how that's ironic thing where, remember, Danton was one of the Maximilien Robespierre's friends, and he stood up against Robespierre. Robespierre had him guillotined. And then the government at the time, which was the convention, had Robespierre guillotined and his followers guillotined. And then we left off with, and I don't think we got to it. So after the the convention was over, they turned around. We're on page 354. They turn around and create yet again another new government. This time, this new government was called the Directory. This was in 1795. A new constitution was written, brought an end to the convention, and they established the Directory. And in the Directory, they actually created a two-house legislature, a bicameral legislature. They created a council of 500, which was 500, and then people. And then the Council of Ancients. They have an executive group and all that there. Unfortunately, though, the Directory had its own set of problems. One of the big ones was money problems. The convention had bankrupted the country there, and it was a time of political unrest, almost kind of a power struggle, if you will. And so they did have a government. It was called the Directory. They had a new constitution. The problem was they didn't have anybody to lead it. I mean, they had people that led it, but there wasn't this one central character that could really lead the country in the way it should be led. And a lot of Frenchmen were tired of the turmoil after turmoil after turmoil, government after government, and they wanted to change it. Well, in steps a man by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte. He joins the scene in 1795. In fact, there was a riot that goes down in Paris against the new government, against the Directory. And Napoleon Bonaparte actually leads a group of soldiers that puts down this uprising. So this riot. So in response, and this is actually one of the things that helped to establish the Directory as the government. So in response, the Directory or the directors chose Napoleon to lead the army, which was at a good time for them because Austria was right now in a conflict with the French. So they take Napoleon, they put him in charge of the army. They say, go fight the Austrians. Well, Napoleon has his own way of fighting. He had gained some experience in the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, as the Europeans call it. He was a very astute military strategist. Was an innovator of his time. He liked to fight underneath what his opponents called new rules. Things like he moved his army at night to help cover the troop movements. He'd fight on Sundays. He would fight in the rain. I mean, this guy revolutionized the way that fighting went down and changed the game, if you will. And because of it, he was ahead of his time. People had to adapt to him. And he was very powerful and very strategic in his attacks. Well, he goes through and he wins victory after victory after victory. He attacks the Austrians here and defends beautifully there, and he's able to just push the Austrians back. He loots from them, and he's able to have Austria, 1797, he has Austria make peace with France. Napoleon comes to Paris as a hero. People, they look at him as a military genius, and he was. The Directory is a little jealous of this. In fact, they want to get rid of him. And so they plot and they say, hey, we have some problems here with Britain. You need to invade them. And they want to send him from France, up the waters there to invade England. But Napoleon has a different idea. He says, hey, rather than attack Britain directly, let's attack some of their most prized possessions and make them attack us. That way we're on the defensive rather than on the attack. Brilliant strategy. So he goes down to Egypt, because Egypt at this time was a big-time corridor for Britain's Far East trade. So he attacks Egypt, takes Egypt over, inciting the British to come to him. Well, they do. And the British come in and they attack him, but they also bring with them other people as well. They bring the Turks, they bring Russia, they bring Austria, and they basically surround Napoleon, surround his army, make it to where he has no escape, make it to where he has no chance to move his troops. Well, Napoleon decides to cut his losses. Napoleon leaves his troops behind in Egypt and goes back to Paris. His army obviously gets captured and they get messed up there, and he leaves his army behind. I mean, whatever happened to him happened. Goes back to Paris, lands in Paris as a hero because he has defeated the British. They don't know what actually happened to his troops down in Egypt because nobody came back to tell him about it. So he comes back to France. He realizes what went down with the Directory trying to get rid of him. He leads something called a coup d'etat, or a coup d'etat you see there. He basically leads a power grab where he and some of his constituents step in and they take over the government. They destroy the Directory. It had lasted for a whopping 4 years now, the Directory. It was time for a change, right? And yet again, another government comes up and he creates one called the Consulate. And the Consulate was very much mirrored to the Roman government, right, back in ancient Rome. And so he sets up this consulate. The consulate basically has 3 consuls there. It's a 3-man group. But the first consul is the one that holds the majority of the power. And of course, who do you think makes himself first consul? Yeah, Napoleon does. And so Napoleon gets it structured, and Napoleon, he promises peace and restores internal order. He gets a peace treaty between Britain and Austria, and things are going very well for Napoleon. People see Napoleon as a hero. People see Napoleon as a guy that takes away the problems of the previous French governments. He's a savior to the everyday Frenchman. That's kind of what they view him as. He steps in and starts a public works program. He builds bridges and builds roads, and he builds canals. He establishes the Bank of France, helps stabilize their money supply. He gets a tax system together to stabilize the national debt. Gets an education system together. One of the biggest things and things that we want to note there, page 356, he gets a series of laws together called Code Napoleon. And this Code Napoleon was a system of laws, a series of laws that some of them are even established and still used today. This was in 1790s. Still around today. Pretty awesome to see. But Code Napoleon, that was his law code there, his law system. He gave concessions to the Roman Catholics. He realized the power that the Roman Catholics had. A lot of people in France were Roman Catholics. So he gave the priests land. He gave them power back. And everything here was pointing to a step in the right direction for the French. People loved the Napoleon's reforms. They enjoyed what he was doing. They thought he was doing a good job. And all along the way, though, he was just giving more and more power to himself. Well, this comes to a big head. 1799, he is just increasing his power. You fast forward to 1802. He makes himself the first consul for life. where he's not voted in year after year or after time period. He's there forever. 1804, he's proclaimed the Emperor of France by the Senate. He doesn't even proclaim it. The Senate proclaims him that. But other people do. So all he's done is he's instituted reforms. He's given the people things that sound good on the outside and work for them on the outside. But he has just further and further and further grabbed power. This comes to quite the head in 1804. He goes to the Notre Dame Cathedral December the 2nd, and he's going to have the Pope crown him emperor. Well, in the ultimate power grab, as he's sitting there waiting for the Pope to give him the crown, he reaches over, he grabs the crown from the Pope, and he crowns himself Emperor of France, rather than letting the Pope do it. And this shows that the people of France have gone from a weak, all-powerful ruler. They've gone from government after government of trying to get it back to normal, to now they've come right back to a single ruler. But this time, this single ruler is an ambitious emperor who has all the power, all the authority. He has absolute power. So they've gone from absolute power to try to have a democracy to back to absolute power. They've given it kind of back and forth, back and forth. Well, one of the first things that Napoleon wants to do is he wants to become the master of Europe. He wants to conquer all of Europe. He wants to be a worldwide leader, not just in France. He doesn't want to be just the ruler in France. He wants to have a worldwide domination. So first thing he wants to do is he wants to destroy Great Britain. Great Britain is his big obstacle, right there, right beside him. If you think of a map of France and Great Britain. So he's going to get some ships out. He's going to go try to attack England. Much like, remember the defeat of the Spanish Armada, right? Back in the 1700s there. Back in the 1500s, 1588, defeat of the Spanish Armada. No, 1688. He wants to defeat the English. Doesn't. There's a guy by the name of Lord Nelson that beats Napoleon's French fleet at the Battle of Trafalgar. This was a naval battle. And I apologize, guys. So Battle of Trafalgar there, and Nelson himself was actually killed in the battle after that there in the ensuing battle of Trafalgar. But the Battle of Trafalgar stops the French from taking the British. That was an important note. The Battle of Trafalgar stops the French advance from trying to take over Britain. So Napoleon says, okay, fine, whatever. I want to attack Britain because they beat me, but I'll go attack their allies. Their allies at this point were Austria and Russia, and also Sweden. They're joining Great Britain, all of them. So he's going to go and he's going to attack Austria and Russia. He's going to do it at a place called Austerlitz. This town called Austerlitz there, this was Napoleon's greatest victory, we like to claim. Napoleon's greatest victory was at Austerlitz. And the reason why is, and I'll have to find a video, I'll drop a video in with this there from YouTube, but he basically baits the Austrians and the Russians to thinking that they're going to beat him. But then he turns around, whips around them, plays the reverse card, right, Raymond? And throws the reverse card on them, and he defeats them. He captures a ton of troops. In fact, he makes it to where these guys are running out on frozen lakes to try to escape capture, and they break through the ice, and they drown in the ice, under the icy waves. And I mean, it was a huge victory for Napoleon. He turns the tide of this worldwide domination at the Battle of Austerlitz itself. And he's going to just continue to push, is Napoleon. So from here on, Napoleon continues to push, and he is able to defeat Austria. He's able to gain other European powers. By 1808, Napoleon becomes the master of Europe. He has control in one way or another by either a conquest or compromise. He has control of all of Europe, except for Britain. Britain is still that Achilles heel. So what he decides to do, instead of putting an invasion in place of Britain, he decides to try to choke them out economically speaking. He implemented something called the continental system. This was where everybody under his control, under Napoleon's control, everybody had to put a trade embargo on Britain. Nobody in Europe could trade with Britain. Now, why do you think he would do that? Yes, exactly. Because if everybody in Europe refused to trade, then Britain's economy would struggle immensely because they're that island nation. They have to have trade back and forth with other European powers. And at first, it sounded like a great idea that if they could blockade British trade, it would cause Britain's economy to collapse. And if their economy collapsed, then they would eventually have to surrender to Napoleon. And the plan was working out fantastic. Unfortunately, though, they figured out there, and this is the people in Europe, because at first, when the people of Europe were taken over by Napoleon, they saw it as a liberation. They said, yay, we've overthrown our oppressive governments. We now have Napoleon to answer to. And they thought it was a good thing at first. But while this continental system was going down, they started to look at what Napoleon was doing, and they realized this is not at all what we wanted. This is not at all what we anticipated. We basically overthrew one oppressive government for another oppressive government. And this oppressive government was doing even worse. He had even less freedoms. He was doing his own thing, taking whatever he wanted and saying, here, you guys stay to yourselves. Oh, by the way, I need soldiers and I need people. I need monies. So they started to want to overthrow this French overlord. They started to disobey this continental system. You had pockets of countries, or you had you had Portugal, you had Spain that wanted to violate the blockade. Russia violates the blockade as well. And the Spanish in particular, they forget the blockade. French troops invade Spain to try to, beat them into submission, if you will. And they put what they call guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla just being the term little wars. They have little pockets of troops that attack the French here and there, here and there. Not all-out attacks of armies, but just little pockets here and there. And eventually, the British actually see this as an opportunity. They land in Portugal. They begin a campaign. They drive the French out of the Iberian Peninsula. So his blockade is not working out all that well, his continental system. So Napoleon says, you know what? I've got to make a statement. Because at this time also, Russia refuses to abide by the continental system. So 1812, France, Napoleon, is going to invade Russia. And he gets a massive army together, 600,000 troops. He gets together, they're called the Grand Army. And he gets them together and they're going to march straight into Russia, march into Moscow. And he wants to take Moscow, and by taking it, his plan was that that Russia would surrender because of this invasion. So he gets his army together, he attacks the front lines, he has this sweeping, massive army, this front line that gets a huge push into Russia. And the Russians obviously are heavily outmanned, they're heavily outgunned. And so they decide to, instead of attacking or fighting or defending face to face, they are going to do something called a scorched earth policy. They say, hey, we're going to just continue to retreat further and further and further back into Russia. Right? Because Russia is this massive expanse of land. And all along the way, they're burning, they're destroying anything that could be of value to the French army. What does that do to them, do you think? What does that do? Think about it. How would that mess up the French army? By burning everything in its path. Yes, by doing that, it would cause the French army to lose more and more and more supplies, because a large portion of their resupply was going to be from taking that supplies that the land gave. Well, we're going to see tomorrow what exactly goes down with Napoleon's armies in Russia.